Hi, I'm Dr. Maria Kordowicz, and today I'll be speaking to you about contemplation and pause, lessons that we can take from the literature. I'm a chartered psychologist and I'm senior lecturer at Lincoln International Business School in business psychology. So, how is contemplation defined? Well, it's the action of exploring, of looking at something for a long period of time. It's reflecting thoughtfully. And contemplation is captured here beautifully by John Linnell, of a shepherd taking time to pause, taking time out from his activity. This painting was produced around a time when there was a traumatic backdrop in terms of agricultural activity and the threat that it faced. And we can, of course, draw parallels here with our current pandemic situation, whereby the trauma that we have collectively experienced as a result of COVID-19 has afforded us, one hopes, some more time for pause. And yet, what has motivated me to put together this talk is that what we have seen is a push for ever greater productivity, a push for a constant response to digital intrusion. And one can indeed conceptualize that heightened productivity as somewhat of a trauma response in light of the pandemic. So theoretically, what is the rationale for the talk? Well, I draw somewhat on Jean Bartunek's work, recent work in organizational studies. She talked about the importance of contemplative activity in our academic lives. She argued that we are so, if you like, focused on calculating the impact of our academic work, of our scholarship. Key examples are the REF and the TEF. And then this can be somewhat deadening. It can prevent us from taking part in contemplative activities. The contemplative activities that are key to us being creative, to us theorizing, to us deepening our knowledge as scholars. And Bartunek draws on the poem Sometimes by Mary Oliver and argues that we should pay attention, we should be astonished, and we should talk about it. And that tripartite verse really captures the importance of contemplative activity. Similarly, Wessels argues that contemplative practice is all about getting a sense of intentionality. Intentionality can mean finding meaning, finding intention, and finding our way through our professional lives and our personal lives that holds intention, that holds an aim that is aligned to our values and aligned to our humanity too. Contemplative leadership is talked about in the literature. So being based in the business school, of course, we have an interest in leadership and management practice. Contemplative leadership is the mark of a leader who comfortably engages with uncertainty. Somebody who can straddle change, who can straddle the unknown and the grey areas, but also a leader who nonetheless helps espouse values of confidence, of strength, and is the guiding light for their followers. Of course, being able to engage with uncertainty means that one needs the space and the time to contemplate, to think and to reflect what that uncertainty may mean. Illes and Jennings, in a really rich paper which focuses on spiritual practice, argue that our leaders can really engage with the facets of human experience which are spiritual, which are thoughtful. And in terms of methods, they promote the use of autoethnography. So it's a sort of reflection on self as a leader. And again, in line with Bartunek, they speak about poetry and the role that poetry can play in affording us pause and space for reflection. So what about teaching? What about pedagogy? Because that's, of course, really relevant to educators. So much of the audience today may well be academics who are interested in how to introduce more reflective practice into their teaching and the theory of how they teach. Well, contemplation by O'Donnell was seen as a way of pushing back against the lack of focus that results from our constant engagement with new technologies. O'Donnell stated that in order for us to regain our attention, our ability to focus, our ability for deep thought, contemplation can lead to something called creative attention, where our attention is used as a way of expanding our efforts, expanding our knowledge, and really helping to integrate our learning. Miglin and others looked at the role of contemplation within surgical training. It was felt of key importance to give students the time to think about and reflect on their learning and the patient cases that they experienced and dealt with. And also what was really important to these scholars is the need for reflection to take part with others. So they highlighted the importance of contemplative activity and reflection in a team. So being able to take the time to have the pause and the ability to discuss our experiences, to discuss our thoughts and feelings. And this led to a mutual sense making, if you like, and an acceptance particularly of some difficult scenarios within surgical training. So again, here we can take lessons for organisations more broadly outside of the remit of healthcare, whereby this scope and time and space and a step away from constant proliferation of work and outputs over outcomes can be rather detrimental. And indeed what we do need is the space for pause and reflection in teams in a non-judgmental and safe space. I wanted to share some more examples from healthcare with you. So my own background is in healthcare. I worked as an NHS, National Health Service manager in England, managing teams and services in a range of settings. I also do quite a lot of consultancy work with the NHS too, and it encompasses a broad range of wonderful activities that I find highly rewarding. But especially during the time of the pandemic, my work has been around affording teams the opportunity for space to contemplate, to think, to reflect, particularly on some of the more traumatic experiences they have had to deal with as a result of the pandemic. So I'm a coach, so I do coach healthcare teams, and for me, really, the importance is in being slow, in taking the time to pause, which we know healthcare teams are typically very responsive. Of course, they have to be, but can organisationally, can the NHS give our colleagues that space for contemplation? And indeed, these are discourses that have been taking place in the NHS, even more so now with thinking about employee well-being given the pandemic situation. So I do quite a lot of work with innovation, so helping teams innovate. Innovation can encapsulate a broad range of activities in healthcare. We can be thinking about how to improve quality through a new idea, how we do something differently in a way that really benefits the patient. And although this paper by Uko and Sinila wasn't from the healthcare sphere directly, there are lots of lessons there, because these authors argue that actually reflection and contemplation, those are activities that are a critical component of promoting innovation in teams. It makes sense, of course, because if we give people the scope, the opportunity to engage in thought, to explore their experiences together, this can then lead to new, innovative understandings, behaviours and experiences. And it helps us make sense of really complex situations too. I should say, of course, that there's always the risk with this, that it becomes rather prescriptive, rather top-down. So when we say, you know, an organisation must give colleagues the space to reflect, well, reflection doesn't always come in a way that's automated or top-down. So just because one provides a lunchtime mindfulness class doesn't mean that suddenly you'll create an innovative, refreshed team that is well. Rather, we need to move away from individualization of the workforce. So this sense of the individual being responsible for their own contemplative lives. Well, to an extent they are, but unless we think about the systemic and structural issues and problems organisationally, for instance, the economic mandate taking precedence over consideration of human lives, the need for constant fast-paced output over creating meaning, over effectiveness, over local community engagement. These things don't just come because, you know, a manager clicks their fingers. They need to really be embedded into the fabric of organisational life. So McIntyre talked about the connection to the sacred when he talked about medics. So this need to, if you like, reconnect with the purpose of the practice of medicine. What is the deeper purpose of the medical practitioner? Well, it's life-giving, isn't it? It's making people better. And actually, I'm sorry, I said McIntyre a he, but it's actually a she. Apologies for that. So this notion that actually in our institutional lives, we may often lose our sense of purpose because the daily demands of teaching and bureaucracy and time pressures and obstacles and admin and chronic overload preclude us from connecting with our sense of purpose and erode our ability to be able to have a clarity around meaning and what we do. So again, McIntyre thinks about the need for pause and draws on poetry yet again. So reading a poem can be a really powerful way to reconnect with the sacred. If I can just go back a slide, there's one more important thing before I too connect, hopefully get you to connect with the poem. There's the pause, which was a scheme that was found to be incredibly effective. It was a University of Virginia emergency department scheme, a contemplative practice which has spread globally. And what this was is when a patient was brought into A&E and they passed away, colleagues had to stop. So they had to pause. So it wasn't just a case of, right, this patient's passed on and we carry on. No, rather they had to break their repetitious habits just for a moment and to take the time to reflect on what just went on and to reflect on the life of that patient before moving on to the next one. And this has spread and really found that not only does it help uphold the well-being of the staff through its very humanity, but has led to really what can be seen as a grassroots movement. It's resistance to neoliberal pressures of constant productivity. And it's a way of reigniting recognition of a shared humanity through this very simple but very purposeful and impactful activity. So to finish off, there's another poem also entitled Sometimes by David Whyte. Now, David Whyte was suggested to me by a colleague, a general practitioner colleague, and he has changed my life. So listening to him really affords me the space for contemplative activities. And he argues that we shouldn't get stuck in contingency, you know, this sense of, I will change my life, I will change my professional practice when this happens, you know, when I buy a house, when the children are older, when I retire. Because actually the when, you know, it doesn't necessarily come. And then, of course, once it does, we're caught up in yet another contingency. So how do we break the pattern? Well, to me, the key thing is also breaking the pattern in organisational behaviour, and doing so through contemplative practice. So here is a part of this poem, Sometimes, that I hope really summarises well and chimes with what I've just begun to scrape the surface of with you today. Requests to stop what you are doing right now, and to stop what you are becoming while you do it. Questions that can make or unmake a life. Questions that have patiently waited for you. Questions that have no right to go away. So the key message here is what's bubbling underneath the surface. So the need for us to reconnect with our sense of purpose, reconnect with our values, not to continue to exist in a state of cognitive dissonance, you know, where the activities we're taking part in don't match our internal realities and what we want to be and what we want to become. To me, this poem says that doesn't go away. The questions remain. And we really need to take time, take pause, and reflect in our shared humanity to begin to find answers to those questions, the questions that have patiently waited for us and that can make or unmake a life. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope that's provided a new perspective for you around the importance of contemplation and pause in professional and organisational lives. Thank you.